Hello. I really enjoy Jujutsu Kaisen, and if you don't know what that is, then one, where the hell have you been? And two, you probably won't understand a thing in this video, so, sorry. Today I wanted to talk about my favorite character in the entire series, Hiromi Higuruma. I can't quite pinpoint exactly what caught my attention when I first read the chapters where he was introduced, but I do know that I was hooked. So for this entire video, I will just be analyzing his abilities and powers to just simply do a case study on him because I think that's fun. I'll be talking about any of his current feats that catch my attention, along with speculating about things I believe that could have either already happened or could happen in the future. I'll also discuss if he has surpassed the grade 1 tier of sorcerers. Spoiler alert, I think he has. So in order to not take too long on an intro, let's begin. Higuruma was first introduced in chapter 143, but it's only a small cameo, so let's just skip over it. His real first showing is in chapter 163, where he faces off against Yuji. This is where we are first introduced to his domain-based curse technique, Deadly Sentencing. When activating his domain, he and his opponent are put into a courtroom-style room with guillotines hanging around them. Higuruma employs the use of a Shikigami named Judgeman, who works as, you probably guessed it, the judge in this court. Within the domain, no violence is permitted for both parties. Make sure to keep this in mind. Judgeman will then accuse the defendant of a crime. The crimes can range from simple loitering to murder if need be. Higuruma does have sway in the matter of what crimes his opponent will be accused of, but he cannot leave the rules of the court in order to do so. For example, he cannot accuse someone of a crime twice in the hopes for a better piece of evidence or a different outcome. Once the trial begins, both parties will argue for their outcome before the defendant will come out with their position. They can deny the claims, accept the claims, or in the case of Yuji, do a bit of both in just the hopes to lessen the blow. There are a total of 3 outcomes that exist within Deadly Sentencing. There could theoretically be more, but we don't really know. The first and best is innocence. Even though we don't see this in the series, it's not hard to imagine what would happen. The defendant would get off scot-free, and the battle will continue normally until Higuruma would reinstate the trial. The second outcome is confiscation. This outcome either removes your primary curse technique or the flow of your cursed energy entirely. It's also been shown to be able to remove immensely powerful cursed objects, which proves there's probably no upper limit to what this thing could do, what it could remove. The final outcome is confiscation, death penalty. Like the former, it will remove your cursed technique, cursed energy, or cursed object, while giving Higuruma the Executioner's Sword. A blade that, if even causes the smallest cut on an opponent, will kill them instantly. Even though we don't actually see this happen in the series, nobody seems to deny his claims or say, oh, you're lying. And the fact that he had 20 sorcerers dead in the Culling Games before he met Yuji, it leads everyone to believe, including myself, that he's not lying. A separate aspect of his curse technique, he seems to be able to use it any time he pleases, which is the ability to manipulate his cursed object, a gavel with a small cross embedded into the wood. This gavel, in the case of a death penalty, will transform into the Executioner's Sword. With the basics of his technique now laid out, I would like to get to my first few pieces of speculation. The first being that if his domain is truly a fair court, or if it will always be in favor of Higuruma. In courts all around the world, there is a counterclaim or countersuit, which is effectively turning the blame from the defendant to the accuser. Now, this speculation is probably the least possible out of the few I have here, but I thought it was more something that would be interesting to think about. Something that probably won't happen, but it maybe could, I'm not sure. In this weird out there situation, let's say that the defendant had broken into a home and stolen some jewelry. If the evidence shows proof of the break-in, that would most likely result in a confiscation, since in Japan the upper limit for a jail sentence for theft is about 10 years. But let's say in this other timeline where Higuruma isn't our Higuruma, he's completely insane and had priorly threatened the defendant into the theft at gunpoint. Now this would obviously never happen, but just stick with me here. If the defendant were to turn the blame onto Higuruma, then there's a chance that the defendant, instead of receiving a confiscation, could receive the executioner's sword, since being held at gunpoint could be considered attempted murder. And then they'd have grounds to receive the sword. Again, this is completely out there and makes no real sense with how Higuruma acts. I just thought it would be something interesting to think about, because who knows if it's a truly fair domain. Like, can the defendant win? Can they actually, like, defeat the accuser? I don't know. No one knows. Maybe him, I don't know. My second piece of speculation is much more grounded and actually could have some canonicity within it. We see that humans, despite having no cursed energy, are far more susceptible to it. This is shown by Gojo limiting his domain by 0.2 seconds in Shibuya in order to not give everyone there permanent brain damage. So what would happen if Higuruma were to lock your everyday Japanese citizen within his domain? I feel like the consensus from most people would be that it just wouldn't do anything, because there's no cursed energy to take away. But that's boring, so I'm going to be different. I believe that Higuruma were to use his domain on the average human, then his domain would function similarly to the stand from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Soft and Wet. Now, if you don't know that stand or the series, I heavily recommend it, but I'll give a brief explanation. The main ability of Soft and Wet is to remove an aspect from something and trap it inside of a bubble. For example, he could steal friction from the floor, or the ability to hear from someone's ears. I believe Deadly Sensing would function nearly identical to this, if used on a cursed energy-less human. Now, maybe the more severe the crime, the worse it takes away. Like, a little petty crime removes your ability to see your peripherals, or removes a feeling from one of your hands. But then a worse crime could result in something like total blindness, or inability to feel anything. It's just something that it was so interesting to think about, that I am so sad that we did not get to see. Do I think this will ever happen? No, not even a little bit. But again, it's just something that's interesting to think about, something that could happen. Now, for my final piece of speculation on this side of things, I like to talk about his potential. When it comes to Jujutsu Kaisen, that word is thrown around with nearly every single character. But when characters in this series can become so immensely strong, with just the right training and time, it's not hard to see why people want to see these characters reach their full strength. I'm going to say something that may cause a bit of outrage, but I wholeheartedly agree that Higuruma has already reached the status of a special grade sorcerer. At minimum, a semi-special grade. I will elaborate more on this in a moment, I promise, but I would first like to talk about what his upper limits could be. First of all, over tens of years, it's not hard to believe Higuruma will become a far better lawyer since his entire technique relies on it. I believe that he could reach a state where he could win trials with even the smallest scrap of evidence, since his intelligence now is already insane. It's incredible. His proficiency would also increase at an incredible speed. It is directly stated by him in the Shinjuku battle that he barely has any combat experience. Keep in mind, this is the same man who was going toe-to-toe with a Heian-era Sukuna. He was even able to put up such a good of a fight. Sukuna directly states he was disappointed he couldn't continue the fight to see how much further it could have gone. Higuruma is an incredibly powerful character, even when he had been a sorcerer for only a few months. I believe his most impressive feat is unlocking Reverse Curse technique mid-battle with Sukuna. Like I just stated moments ago, he's only been a sorcerer for a few months. And before the battle with Sukuna, it stated that Higuruma has either no or very little training with RCT. So that means a sorcerer with barely any training, practically fresh to the Jujutsu world, and fighting the strongest character to ever grace the verse, has already reached a level higher than most characters in the series. That is batshit insane when you put it into perspective. Keep in mind that Gojo was a second year at the time he finally grasped RCT, which means that he had been a full-fledged sorcerer for at least a minimum of a year and still wasn't able to understand it. And that is being generous to Gojo. It is baffling how quickly Higuruma is growing. If in only a few months he's capable of at least holding his ground against Sukuna, then he'll be with the likes of Yuta and Gojo in just a few more. Now that I'm done with the RCT glaze, I'll move on to what I believe his technique could evolve into. If Higuruma's technique is directly tied to his gavel and only his gavel, then I only believe he will become far more proficient with that. It could get to a point where he could create doubles, control them remotely, or even create so many he could just bury his opponent beneath gavels. There really is no saying what his upper limit is because we are only seeing him at the very beginning of all of his training. Now, if his curse technique doesn't just apply to his gavel, but all objects of a court that are charged with curse energy, then Higuruma could become far more powerful than ever before. For example, if Higuruma were able to get a piece of cursed evidence, he could then manipulate it the same way he does his gavel. Like said before, he would be able to duplicate his cursed objects, which could potentially send out hundreds of pieces of paper to swarm his opponent. Not only would they effectively blind his opponent, but they could also be used like little dismantles that cause hundreds of paper cuts all across the opponent in seconds. And if you don't think that's enough to like damage someone, maybe he'll start carrying a lemon in his pocket and just squirt it at him when they're all cut up. And now that I'm complete with talking about how he could potentially become one of the strongest sorcerers alive, I will argue that he isn't far off already. I will go over why I personally believe that Higuruma is already a special grade sorcerer. The main three requirements are pure immense strength, something that breaks the norms of Jujutsu Society, and the ability to overthrow a country. I believe that Higuruma not just applies to one of these, not two, but possibly all three. I know I probably sound like a raving madman who's begging for another spoon because rust keeps getting in my heroin, but please just hear me out on this. The first, which I believe to be the most agreed upon, is that Higuruma definitely breaks the norms of Jujutsu Society. The Limitless technique is widely agreed to be the strongest technique in the series, with Shrine and Ten Shadows being very close behind. Do you know what Higuruma can do with every single one of those techniques? He can make them vanish in the wind like your father. He can quite literally remove Limitless technique from a sorcerer. I'm not sure if I'm making it quite apparent how fucking insane that is. That alone is grounds to break Jujutsu norms, but it gets even crazier. Doesn't matter who he goes up against, no matter how impossibly powerful, if they get even a little cut from the Executioner's sword, they will die instantly. That means Gojo, Yuta, Sukuna, Yuji, even Jackpot Hikari, no one is living this man if he got even a little bit better with his combat. That's my first point. Now for the second, which is just immense power. I think this one's pretty self-explanatory. Executioner's sword is the strongest thing in the entire verse. So, even though it can be circumstantial, I don't think that's enough to pull it back to not be seen as extraordinarily overpowered. Next requirement. This is the one that tripped me up the most out of the three, because realistically, Higuruma isn't taking over a country. He just can't, and I know that. So this one just had me stumped. I really didn't know what to do here. I considered just letting this requirement flop over and show its belly, but something was eating away at me and I didn't know what. That's when I just began to think about the other special grades. Now, Gojo is obviously a special grade, same with Geto and Sukuna, but then I began to think about the other sorcerers. Specifically, Yuki and Yuta, and to a lesser extent Yuji, since most believe him to be breaching special grade by the end of his fight with Sukuna. So I began to think, would Higuruma win against them? Yes. The only person I think could give him trouble is Yuta, since his technique is a bit muddy with what's his technique and what Rika is. Maybe I'm just stupid and can't read. I don't know. So I'll just focus on Yuki for this. Without her technique, she wouldn't have access to Garuda, and without her technique, she really has nothing to do. So she would just get destroyed by Higuruma in my eyes. Same with Yuji, provided it would remove all of his curse techniques and not just one at a time, which I'm not sure about. And after those thoughts died out, I began to think, could Yuji or Yuki really even take over a country? Like, what is Yuki gonna do against a cluster bomb that takes out half a city? Not much. But then that thought just made me go insane because no one really seemed like a special grade besides Sukuna and Gojo and maybe Geto, depending on what he's got in his back pocket. So after crying and shitting myself in a corner for a few days, I just decided to change how I saw the situation. I stopped thinking about this character against an army in a one-on-one, but rather their power versus the army's power. Say you took all of Yuta's power and put it into a ball, Rika included, and then you took the entire Japanese military's power and put it into a ball. Yuta's power would probably be larger than that of the military's. So I did the same with Higuruma, and I really don't know. It just depends on if you consider the Executioner's sword part of his total power or just a subsidiary. So, in the end, it's up to what you think. I personally do think that Higuruma would scale higher than an army, but maybe you don't. I don't know. This topic has driven me insane. I'm just fine leaving it at maybe. And that's the video. I will probably be making a second video that goes over his character and just him as an overall person instead of his powers and abilities. I don't know. It just really depends on how this one turns out. So, with that, I don't know, go jerk off or something. Why are you asking me?